So today we're going to talk about one of history's most famous battles, the Battle of Waterloo. In 1815, Napoleon made his last stand against the coalition army in Belgium. To this day, it remains the final confrontation between France and the coalition forces. The battle took place in modern-day Belgium, near a small village called Waterloo, which had a population of about 450 people at the time. On June, about 60,000 soldiers from several European nations clashed in what would be known as the Battle of Waterloo. What makes this battle so fascinating is that it was the end of a long line of battles started by the French Revolution more than 25 years earlier. It also marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which had been raging across Europe since 1792. Before we get into the battle itself, let's quickly look at how we got here. In 1799, Napoleon seized power in France in a coup d'état, ending the French Revolution and establishing the consulate with himself as first consul. During the Napoleonic Wars, he conquered much of Europe and at one point ruled over a huge empire spanning from Spain to Russia. But eventually, the French Empire began to crumble when Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 led to massive casualties. By 1814, the Allies had pushed Napoleon from power and forced him to abdicate. He was exiled to the island of Elba off the coast of Italy, where he spent 10 months in relative luxury. But Napoleon was never really comfortable with the idea of living out the rest of his days in exile, and in early 1815, he escaped back to France. When he arrived in Paris, the city erupted in celebration, and the government recognized Napoleon as emperor once again. This period of time between Napoleon's first abdication and return to power is often referred to as the 100 Days. It only lasted 100 days, because just 100 days after he reclaimed power in France, he was defeated and died in exile. Now that Napoleon was back in power, the coalition forces who had previously defeated him were not happy about this turn of events. They wanted to keep him exiled on Elba for the rest of his life, so they declared war on France. Napoleon was determined to defeat the coalition once and for all and reclaim his empire. On June, he and his army set out from Paris to meet the advancing coalition forces. The opposing armies first met at the Battle of Ligny on June, where Napoleon's brother Jerome defeated the Prussians. But the next day, part of the coalition forces defeated Napoleon's allies, the Dutch and the Confederated Germans, at the Battle of Quatre Bras. As the two sides prepared for a final confrontation, they met at the village of Waterloo. Today, there is a large monument marking the spot where the two armies clashed. Napoleon's army was outnumbered by the coalition forces, but he knew he could compensate for this disadvantage with superior tactics. His army was made up of veterans from his original guard units, as well as some newer conscripts. The vast majority of the army was still experienced, though, having fought alongside Napoleon for many years. Coalition forces, on the other hand, were made up of troops from Great Britain, the Netherlands, Prussia, Russia, Austria, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Saxony, Portugal, Spain, and the German Confederation. These troops were not necessarily fighting as a cohesive unit, though. Many of them were there due to personal or regional rivalries with Napoleon. For example, the British sent an army of 83,000 men under the command of the Duke of Wellington. He had previously defeated Napoleon's sister, Caroline, at the Battle of Corunna in Spain. There was also a strong Prussian force under the command of Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, who was eager to avenge his country's defeat at Ligny. There was also a contingent of about 20,000 men from the Dutch under the command of Prince William Frederick of Orange, who also had a personal vendetta against Napoleon. See, Napoleon had previously invaded and occupied the Netherlands. William Frederick had lived in exile in Britain ever since. Now he finally had a chance to take back his homeland. And then there was, of course, Napoleon, who was hoping to add the Netherlands to his empire once again. As you can see, there were a lot of personal rivalries at play in addition to the larger geopolitical conflict. The fighting began around noon when a heavy rain began to fall, which ended up being a good thing for Napoleon. The rain made the ground muddy, which slowed down the heavy cavalry charges that the British were planning to use. The bulk of Napoleon's army was positioned along a ridge behind the farm. Here, a stone monument now stands commemorating the site. To their right, or south, was the village of Waterloo. On their left was a farmhouse known as La Haye Sainte. Behind the ridge was another farmhouse known as the Boutoir, where Napoleon's headquarters was set up. Wellington's troops attacked first, pushing back the French and forcing them into the village. But as darkness fell, both sides retreated to their positions for the night. Fighting resumed at dawn the next morning. Heavy fighting continued throughout the day, with neither side able to gain the upper hand. During the battle, the Prussians approached from Napoleon's left flank, but he managed to hold off their attacks until late in the afternoon. At around 6:30, Wellington received word that the Prussians were only half a mile away and fast approaching. By this time, Napoleon had been fighting for nearly 16 hours. His forces were exhausted, and the Prussians were only getting closer. Knowing that he was in a precarious position, Napoleon ordered a final massive assault. Unfortunately, his troops did not have the strength to carry out the attack effectively, and it failed. Within minutes of the attack's failure, Blücher's Prussian forces arrived on the battlefield. Seeing the hopelessness of his situation, Napoleon ordered his army to stop firing and surrender. In total, about 40,000 soldiers were killed or wounded during the battle, including some 15,000 French soldiers, 25,000 coalition troops, and 400 civilians. Of those who survived, many died later of their wounds. After surrendering, Napoleon escaped on horseback, riding all the way to Paris without stopping. From there, he fled south, eventually crossing the border into modern-day Switzerland. He hoped to raise another army in Switzerland and continue fighting, but this plan failed. On July, Napoleon arrived in Rochefort in southwestern France. He attempted to disguise himself and escape to the United States, but was captured and taken to St. Helena in the Indian Ocean, where he spent his final years in exile. He died there in 1821 at the age of 51. In contrast to Napoleon's tragic end, the victors of Waterloo enjoyed a victory parade through the streets of Paris later that year. So why is the Battle of Waterloo so important? For one, it marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which had been raging across Europe since the French Revolution. It also marked the end of the French Revolutionary era and the return of the Bourbon dynasty to power in France. But perhaps most importantly, the battle was the final chapter in the story of Napoleon, one of history's most famous military leaders. It was also the last great battle in which the outcome was decided by the skill of the generals and the bravery of the soldiers on the battlefield. With the advent of new technologies like tanks and airplanes, warfare would never be the same again. And speaking of new technologies, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something new. If you did, please hit that like button. Also, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.